Welcome to this fireside chat with Nick Beckstead. Nick is the CEO of the FTX Foundation. He's been working as a grant maker and researcher in the effective altruism community since 2009. Prior to joining the FTX Foundation team, Nick was an early employee at Open Philanthropy, where he worked for 7 years. Before that, he was a research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, completed a PhD in moral philosophy at Rutgers University, and helped launch the Center for Effective Altruism. Welcome, Nick. Thanks for doing this fireside chat.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
So could you set the scene for us? What's the current focus of the FTX Future Fund?
So in a big picture, we're trying to do as much as we can to improve humanity's long-term prospects. And we're hoping to scale up our giving significantly over the next few years. And so this year, we're trying to learn as much as we can about how we can do that effectively. The focus is on testing funding models that could be massively scalable in the sense that we see how they could really scale up a lot and still be very cost effective. And the ones that we've been focused on so far are a re-granting program where we've kind of deputized about 100 people to go and make grants on our behalf. Mm-hmm. An open call where a lot of what we've been hoping for is trying to launch new projects, because I think in order for the effective altruism community to kind of effectively use all of the capital that it has, I think we need more projects out there. And so we did an open call, and we did a big write-up of projects we'd like to see launched, and funded some of those. And those have been our kind of two big tests, and we're also interested in doing work on prizes later in the year, and something that's maybe more focused on just getting people to launch new projects, possibly involving a little bit more of us getting actively involved in that process. So those are kind of the two other things we're testing. And then in the background, we're also kind of trying to get more thoughtful about evaluating everything that we've done. So we're kind of building some cost effectiveness models and trying to get numerical about how good we think these grants are that are coming in through these different mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. So if you're kind of in testing phase at the moment or experimenting phase, do you sort of expect as time goes on to sort of settle on different types of models of grant making?
I think so. Yeah, I think probably we'll find some of these have more. We have a sense that they're more promising, and so some of them will get scaled up and some of them will get discontinued or remain small. Mm-hmm. And because I'm excited to see where that goes, and I don't really know where it will. So, mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you might have answered this already, I guess, in that question, but what is it that makes Future Fund distinctive from other kinds of philanthropic funds out there, even within the EA community?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess. So in the world at large, I guess it's distinctive because it's kind of run by these young people that are really into effective altruism and have kind of are focused on this long-termism stuff, and so that's distinctive. But within the EA community, I would say the things that are kind of distinctive right now are first that we're testing these massively scalable funding models and kind of doing that in a specific way where we're trying to do quite big versions of them and learn quickly. Mm-hmm. And second, kind of related to that is it's not a sort of program officer first model. So a lot of foundations, it's kind of you have a program officer, maybe they have program associates working with them, and they're kind of thinking about what an area needs and planning out the strategy and making all of the grants in there, and they could use whatever mechanisms. But this is kind of more like a generalist team that is testing funding models, and we might move more in that program officer direction down the road as we sort of specialize into pieces of this. But that's something kind of interesting and distinctive. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and maybe you slightly have paved the way for that because you do have these areas of interest set out on your website for the kind of different areas that you're interested in funding. It includes some kind of maybe areas that are well known like AI and biorisk, but as well as some other things like epistemic institutions, I think you call it, and values and reflective processes. Yeah. So could you tell us a bit more about why you picked those particular areas of interest?
Yeah. So I could say a bit about them specifically. So epistemic institutions, I feel like I feel like, what do I mean by that? So what we mean is institutions for discovering the truth, and like what's an example of that? I don't know, like Wikipedia is an example of that or something, or university is an example of that, or like a jury trial, or forecasting, like super forecasters or something. These are all they're institutions that like kind of serve a standardized role for figuring out the truth, and like a newspaper is an epistemic institution or something. So anyway, it's kind of a broad concept, but I think these things are sort of interestingly they're really important, and they're hard to kind of build markets around. So if you think about there's all these things and they affect our discourse in a big way, but it's hard to monetize information. And they don't always have the best incentives when you do monetize them. And so I think there's some sense that this is like a big deal, and maybe a bit neglected by philanthropy, and maybe I think there's kind of certain vibes of ways of thinking about like careful and precise reasoning that I think are just kind of underrated and we're interested in amplifying. And what could you do with that? I think that could be of use to things that are kind of classic cause areas for people who are interested in humanity's long-term prospects. Like if I think about things that are sort of dysfunctional, say, with like conversations about potential risks from advanced AI, I feel like some of the issues are that you don't necessarily know who you should trust on this, and maybe and some of it like doesn't fit into sort of standard academic niches or something like that. But anyway, to kind of boil it down a bit, I think it's easy to imagine a world where you could have more trustworthy sources of information about timelines and likely effects of AI, and something that's built in this epistemic institution's place is useful for it. And so that could be useful externally for sort of like validating information that comes from a reliable source, but is hard to recognize as a reliable source. Could be useful to the EA community for its own thinking and prioritization. And I think it could be useful for like, issues that maybe we haven't thought of. We might be glad that we've built that infrastructure. So, I mean, those are some thoughts on that. And then kind of more broadly, I think I have a feeling that within kind of the broad long-termist type project, there's kind of a wide range of things. And I feel like it's useful to have a lot of possibilities and be open to a lot of possibilities and, experiment with those. So I think of these areas of interest as kind of indicating not necessarily that every single one of them is going to be something we'll be doing 5 years from now, but all of them are things that I think are plausibly a really big deal, and we're interested in being aware of opportunities in those places.
Yeah, so I imagine that the counter kind of approach that you could have, and that maybe some other people might have in the community, is really zoning in on some of maybe the most urgent risks, or some of the things that it seems like there's the most targeted interventions that we could do in these spaces. Whereas it sort of seems like, at least in these areas of interest, Future Fund is interested in some of these like more experimental approaches, maybe some of these like broader approaches that might set the good foundations for like future work. Is that like a deliberate kind of choice in approach there?
Yeah, that's deliberate, and I'm interested in both types of things. I think it's especially true when I think about it from a learning point of view. So like, if we're focused on trying to have massively scalable approaches to grant making and test funding models for that, it seems like it's useful to widen the field, and these are some things that have gotten less attention otherwise, and so maybe there's some interesting opportunities there. I don't mean to make a strong statement that they like will be better than the best targeted things or something, but I think it's interesting to run that experiment and see what comes out, and I think they could be. And I also like the idea of sort of. I think that the idea of trying to make humanity's long-term prospects as good as possible has a sort of life of its own that's independent of just that's independent of just AI and biosecurity. And I think it's interesting to think about what that could be. And so all of those things have some attraction to me.
Okay, so that was sort of a discussion about the areas of interest that FTX Future Fund has. You also have on the website this long list of project ideas that sort of set out things that you'd be excited to fund. What is the thing that you're trying to accomplish by listing out those projects?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. So one is just the sort of basic point of, well, I don't know, maybe if we list these and someone visits our website, they'll be like, actually, I have wanted to do that. And I had no idea that someone would be interested in funding it. And I'd love to connect and launch that project and get it started. So that'd be really the best case scenario. And there have been some cases of that are cool and I'm excited about. There was one of the things in epistemic institutions that we asked for was a kind of a website where you could sort of do standardized surveys of academics from different areas and get them to answer questions on various topics. I think sometimes it can be tough to figure out what a representative sample of experts in some area think. And I think if you just kind of set up a good system for that, you can systematize it and make it easier. And anyway, that's something, and we wrote that up, and Apollo Academic Surveys applied to our open call, and it was like, yep, we'll make that. Like, great, let's do it. So that's a piece of it. And then I also think that I think there's a lot that can be done to improve humanity's long-term prospects. I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities, and sometimes I feel like people. I think sometimes I feel like people feel like, oh well, isn't all the good stuff being funded, or isn't I feel like maybe this is a more common point of view in the EA community than the world at large or something. But sometimes I feel like I run into people who think that all the kind of promising stuff is being tried, and I feel like there's a wide range of things that can be done, and we're really in need of founders who want to launch those projects and have a vision to do it. And I kind of want to communicate something about that. Yeah. And
is the thing that you're communicating that you think that these are vetted ideas that are probably robustly good to try, or are you communicating something like, I think this case kind of has some case behind it, I'd like to see how it goes, or something else entirely?
80% of the way to the latter thing or something, but yeah, I think, and it varies project by project or something, but it feels to me like there are a lot of things that could be tried, and I also feel like, there's an interesting point where I think there's a lot of people who are in the effective altruism community who are looking for a meaningful way to contribute, and there's maybe if you're looking for one of the very top jobs at a small number of organizations, maybe there's not always enough, and there's more labor demanded than supplied. But I think kind of wanted to expand the option space and be no, look, there's a lot of stuff that can be done and that would be valuable. Yeah, that does seem really valuable, especially if once some of these projects are started up, they then sort of open up more spots for other people to come and join the organizations, even if they aren't quite the right person to sort of be the founder and spin it up themselves. Okay. And so you mentioned at the beginning the sort of different things that you've experimented with so far. So there was the open call for people applying, and then the regranters project as well as funding directly by staff. Yep. I'd love to go through each of those. I think you've written up some reflections on how those went on the forum, so it'd be lovely to dive into those a bit more. Sure. Do you want to start with the open call? How did that go? Yeah, sure. The open call. Let's see, how did the open call go? So we got a lot of applications, about 1,700 applications. We were only open for 3 weeks, so there was a lot of interest in applying. And I think without looking at my exact notes, I think we funded about $25 million of grants from people who applied through that round. That is pretty impressive. Congratulations to the team. Yeah, thank you. And I think there was a wide range of projects. So there was a bunch of things from within the effective altruism community, and then there were also things that were kind of coming in from just experts in different, it's we have a PPE area in biosecurity, and people, kind of showed up and had interesting projects that we kind of wouldn't have expected to hear about that came and we were happy to fund. And there were more in other areas. So it was a pretty interesting experiment. I think it was a lot of work to do it, and it was less kind of, if you looked at team time per dollar granted, and and if we looked at kind of trying to adjust that for how much impact we think it had, I think it was maybe not as good as some of the other things that we've been doing, but I think it's something that if we found a more efficient way to do it, I think it could be something that we do at scale in the future. But yeah, probably least excited about it amongst the things we've tried, but I think we could be able to find a way to make it a bit better. Yeah.
You kept it pretty broad this time where, despite the fact that you have the project ideas, you were accepting a cool, sort of applications for all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
Was there a reason for doing that specifically, or could you see maybe restricting it to actually some of the specific ideas that you're most interested in?
It's a great question. I think we did it, I think we left it totally open-ended because I think one of the things in my, sometimes I feel like the effective altruism community is kind of inward-looking. And one of the things we were trying to do with the open call was to say in a really kind of punchy way what we're about and broadcast it pretty widely and kind of create an easy opportunity for people to try to get funded and work in our areas. And one of the things that you might hope for would be that there are people for whom the sort of project of doing what you can to most improve humanity's long-term prospects. Maybe that resonates, or maybe the way of thinking resonates, and they kind of haven't been reached. But you have this. You don't necessarily want to constrain people's creativity too much. And maybe there'd be really exciting ideas that are just totally have nothing to do with our areas of interest, and yet would be outstanding from that point of view. And so that was part of our motivation for that. I think we got less of that than we were hoping for. Could be that we just didn't have that open for long enough and people haven't gotten to know us for long enough. But yeah, so that's, and then I think the downside of that is you do get more stuff that's just not really on topic. So I think there's an interesting trade-off, and I'm not sure if we did it again, maybe we would want to be more specific in some ways, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay, so that was the open call, which I guess feels relatively kind of more traditional as a way of doing grant making. I think to me at least, the Regranter program seems like a more experimental type project. I don't know if that's right, actually. I think probably you know more about the space than I do. What kind of what was the motivation for doing that as a particular way of doing grant making, and also how did it go?
Yeah, I think the basic idea of that program is that, maybe funders, maybe people who are just focusing on making grants all the time might not see all of the best opportunities that are out there. One pattern that I feel like I've seen in program officers' careers is often some of their best grants are they make them early in their career, and it's people that they kind of already know about and have a hypothesis that these people need to get empowered. And so you might think that there would be some kind of diminishing returns to capital across people. If some people fund the best ideas from their network, then they kind of as it goes down, there's diminishing returns. And I think the re-granting program tries to kind of exploit that and say, okay, well, maybe there are more people who have different networks, different tastes, different ideas, and we'll give them a chance to go out and make grants. So we kind of deputized over 100 people to do this, gave them kind of budgets that we sort of tried to fund things that were within reason, within the category, and gave them a lot of deference about what's worth trying. So that's kind of the basic idea. And I think we've been excited about how that has turned out. I think that's resulted in a lot of grants that we wouldn't have been making ourselves. And I think some of the re-granters have found it a kind of interesting and empowering experience. I really like the idea of kind of being very action-oriented and concrete about suggestions for making things better in a community. And I think a really concrete way is like, well, the power is in your hands. Name who should do it and like arrange it, and we'll provide the capital, and we can see how it goes. So I've been excited about that. I've been excited about some of the projects that have been funded through that. Within the epistemic institutions category, there's a group called Manifold Markets that's running a kind of play money prediction market, and I think the founders are doing a good job, and excited about them trying that, and excited about empowering that. And I think there's also a lot of things where it's just somebody. It's like maybe there's a relatively young person and they're giving a small grant to a friend to study machine learning over the summer, so they can skill up in an area where they might be able to make a big impact. And I think some of those grants would be really hard for us to figure out should happen. Or maybe the person would never even have applied because they didn't know that was an option or wouldn't have felt comfortable, but they talked to somebody about it and they just decide to do it. So I think that's pretty cool. So it will, but we're planning to review it more systematically when the sort of 6-month experiment is over.
Yeah, it sort of feels like being a good grant maker is not obviously an easy skill for lots of people to acquire, and maybe you've been doing it for a while and sort of have built up a bunch of good judgment and things like that. Did you have any concerns about sort of whether people had enough expertise or a good kind of taste in this kind of thing?
Yeah, I did have some concerns about that, and to some extent, especially, I don't know, if you think about, so for some areas, say it's just, there's a lot of science projects, say, where, either it's going to go to zero or it might be a good idea. And there's some projects where it's if you did it suboptimally, maybe we're actually worse off. And we wanted to try to put in some guardrails around that. So, the grant recommendations come in, they get screened by us, and if there's red flags that we feel like we can't totally figure out ourselves, then we run it by some other people and see if they have concerns, people who are kind of in that area. And so I think that this was a concern, but we end up kind of having to decline only a pretty small fraction of the grants. And for the most part, I feel like the people that we've bet on, I feel like they've brought us pretty interesting ideas, and definitely I feel excited about that experiment happening, and feel like there's not a ton where I'm kind of oh man, I wish we didn't make that grant, So
that's good.
Yeah.
I guess that leads me on to our next question, which is a bit about this kind of impact evaluation and monitoring piece. Yeah, I guess you mentioned that some of these experiments are still ongoing and you haven't done the full analysis, but I'm curious about what is it that you've done so far? What are you planning on doing?
Yeah, obviously, a lot of the things we're working on are really long-term problems. So, it's tough to ground truth is tough to have on how it's going.
There's no Geiger counter for measuring existential risk.
That's right.
Levels.
So what are we doing then? I think what we're doing is, we're looking at what's come in, and we're having our own intuitions about it. We're doing some back of the envelope calculations.
Classic.
And we're and we're also paying a little bit of attention to issues like, who else is excited about this? Are we the only ones who think this is good? If so, maybe that's a little worrying. So paying attention to some things like that. There's also things that could be happening that aren't happening. Could be that just very few people in the re-granting program make grants at all. Or it could be that you run this open call and anything that's worth funding also applied to EA funds and they said yes to it. Or it could be that, so we're looking for some things like that and using that a bit to gauge our process. We're putting some more effort now that we've made a bunch of grants. I find it more interesting to sort of think about how cost effective something that is actually an ongoing project is than some project that may get launched and because you don't even know what it is so we're trying to put some numbers to these things Leopold's been working hard at that. I'm excited about it to see what comes out.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I guess you're taking on this really huge and ambitious challenge to be, I guess, judiciously ambitious to try and make really a large scale of kind of new philanthropic funding out there. I'm wondering how, given what you've done so far, sort of how overall optimistic or pessimistic are you about being able to kind of give away as much as you were hoping to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of hard question to answer in a way because, it's obviously depends on what standard you're holding yourself to. So if you're holding yourself to a low standard, you can kind of give a lot and it's going to be easy. And so, how to answer that question, Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a tough question to answer for that reason. But I think I am.
You would also do some self-correction, as in you would change the standard a little if you weren't actually being able to meet the bar that you've given yourself?
I think that is also part of what's confusing about the question, because I'd sort of be like, if we set the bar here and we were going to be unable to achieve it, I mean, I guess if someone else was just if we were here and somebody else was over here, then maybe we should make them our biggest regranter ever or something. But it's. So it's a little tough to think about. I think in the end we kind of want to we'll do the best we can with what we've got, and if we think someone else could use the money more productively, then we're always open to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I'll circle back in a couple of years' time when we've got more So if someone in the audience is thinking about applying for funding next time there's an open call or something, do you have any particular pieces of advice that you'd want to give people about what they should be thinking of applying for or how they should be approaching this?
Yeah, it's interesting. So thinking back on the open call, I feel like my number one way that if you just said, hey, there was an application and you were kind of annoyed by it, why was that? The most common answer would be I wish it was a lot more specific. I think I often and I think this is a presentation thing, but also a reality thing. It's much more exciting to back somebody who has a really specific and compelling vision about what exactly it is that they want to do, and also just concrete activities about how they're going to get there. So, and I also find it often more exciting when there's more of a hypothesis. So something that sounds kind of we're going to get experts together and talk about, how to solve problem X, and then think about what to do on problem X or something, is a lot less exciting to me than a kind of, is a lot less exciting to me than something that's a bit more a concrete theory about how we make progress on problem X that you can do yourself and get started on now, I think is often more exciting. Or if it was the thing of bring people together, if it could be, it's these specific people and our theory is that we're going to elicit their answers in this specific way, we're going to forecast these questions and combine them. I think often so something about being specific, I think, is super helpful and super important. I also think that so while I'm very excited about growing the effective altruism community and being and finding good ways to communicate its key ideas, I also feel like I would like to see the effective altruism community be more focused on like object level problems, and especially in the long-termist arena, and just be thinking about how we can organize ourselves and just go for them directly. So I think like things like that I think are really exciting to see. And I think they can sometimes be underrated by our community. Like, I think sometimes we think that stuff that's meta is sort of automatically better for like getting more people involved in an important problem. But I think often just when you look at companies that have scaled successfully, often the best way to like get a lot of people working productively on a problem is to like just start working on it productively and like sort of blaze the trail and like help onboard and mentor the people who can also do it. And so I think I'd be excited to see more projects like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how does that sort of interrelate with the point that sort of maybe we've had quite good evidence that the community building or the meta work has been really good? I think like Will McCaskill in his forum post about sort of the funding challenge or the funding like situation in EA points out that we've actually just got really good evidence that actually this has like really got great returns. So like are both things true at the same time?
I think they're both true, and we fund it a bunch, and I think we're going to keep funding it, and I'm like interested in amplifying all of it. Maybe I also feel like as our community, as we have more people who are working in these areas, and there's more capital available, in some sense I feel like we kind of like, I don't know, it's like it becomes more important to sort of like cash in on the sort of implicit trust and promise of that. And I think things that, so I feel like I haven't totally articulated why, but so there's something that feels very important about that to me.
Yeah, makes sense. So I guess talking about that kind of the funding situation across EA as a whole, I think you're aware there's been a fair amount of discussion on the Effective Altruism Forum about the various effects that it might have on community kind of epistemics or culture. So there are some worries about the additional amount of funding that there is available in particularly in long-termist areas, maybe affecting sort of people's epistemics or attracting people who are just seeking more funding and aren't as interested in the ideas, or even just like bad optics in general. So there's a few of the kind of worries that have been discussed. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to see if you had any thoughts about that, or how worried you are about any of these effects.
Yeah, I think these are important things to be careful about, and I wrote a post that was like some clarifications on the Future Fund's approach to funding that was kind of trying to explain how we were responding to that. Basically, I think when I think about our role and what we can do to minimize those problems, I think it's important. I think there's something about how we communicate what we're doing and our intentions that's important. And then I think there's something about just having good processes for screening for certain types of downsides, such as somebody who's maybe not really that interested in working on these problems per se, and is like just trying to get some funding, or kind of bringing like changing the culture in a strange way. So we try to address that by having just like a number of stages where the issues could be caught. Screening the staff members who are sort of like screening the applications or the incoming regrants, and people in sort of like specialized channels like our community health channel or community building channel, or biosecurity or AI, where we've kind of got advisors who help us look out for that thing if there's something that seems off. So we try to address it that way, and I think we're like doing a pretty reasonable job. How worried am I about it more broadly for the community? I mean, I definitely think I think it's great that there's more capital in here, and we'll be a lot better off for it. So definitely, that'd be kind of my headline. I think it remains to be seen, like how all of these things play out, and we should just keep watching. Sometimes I think the communications matter more than the reality of it or something, or they matter almost as much. If we all talk about how money is abundant and let's just spend it if it saves us a little bit of time, and we talk about it in the wrong way and treat it glibly, I think that actually makes the problem worse. And I think if we talk about it in a way that is like kind of, I don't know, takes more seriously the opportunity cost of all the capital that's available, I think, and just like insist on a certain level of common sense about it, I think we can make some of those things better.
Okay, so there's a bit that sounds like the responsibility is to some extent disproportionately maybe on grant makers in the screening and evaluating potential funding opportunities. But there is also some responsibility on all of us, because the communications, the way that we talk about this is like all of us are part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a slightly interesting example is I think it's important that the FTX Foundation communicates about its work. I think, before we had communicated about all of our grants, I think some people maybe had an inaccurate impression of what we were doing that's kind of more vibes driven or something. And, I just think talking about things in the right way, because this is partially is in a large degree a perception issue, the communication around it is very important. And, if we can avoid sort of sensationalizing it, I think that actually helps solve the problem.
Okay, cool. So that was kind of a lot of questions about the grant making so far of the foundation. I'd love to switch gears a little bit and just talk a bit about the team and how you've managed to do all this. So I don't know if you could set the scene about what your role specifically as CEO involves.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it involves making sort of some of the final decisions, setting the vision, and bringing the team on board. I'm really happy with the people we're working with. I think they're really amazing people that are super dedicated to our mission, really smart, really hardworking, and I think if we didn't bring those people together, I think it'd be hard to. I think it'd be impossible to do as well as we've done so far. Yeah.
It's a pretty impressive amount to have done with, I think, just 5 people on the team. Is that right?
There's the FTX Foundation. Yeah, there's me and Will McCaskill advising us, Leopold Aschenbrenner, Avital Balwit, Kathan Ramakrishnan, and Ross Rangens, are all here. So it's a very small team, and we've moved a lot of money already. And yeah, I mean, I think we shouldn't use money moved as a performance metric, because it really matters how good those grants are, and to some extent that remains to be seen. But I do feel excited about getting things up to speed and moving quickly, and we'll be reflecting on it and looking back over time to think about how good it has been.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about plans for maybe prizes and things like that. Do you have plans to grow the team, to move in this direction of the program officers or any things like that?
Yeah, on hiring, I think I have a philosophy of kind of moving kind of slowly, and I think it's important.
That seems very surprising for FTX.
Yeah, well, in some ways there's something similar. So FTX is also very small in terms of the number of team members versus say the value of the company and its total revenue, and I think there's something useful about it, because if you grow too quickly, I think you can lose track of what everybody is doing, and it can be harder to pivot and change. So I I've been trying to hold a really high bar for the new people that we bring on, and to try to like really make sure that we understand what we're doing and we're happy about it before scaling it up further. And I think in the long run, that'll keep us like kind of tightly organized and focused on important things, and put us in a good position to scale. But I don't know, it's an interesting debate. And I think sometimes people look at it and are like, why aren't you guys hiring more? And I guess my answer is like, I think this is our fastest way to like build a good version of this organization. And I think that like going slowly and deliberately and making sure that you've like, the culture is right and the people are in the right roles and like we know what the new people would do before kind of, adding more and more people is really important.
Great. Okay. So in a previous life, you were a philosophy PhD student, have also kept your hand in doing research over the years. I was quite curious to ask you a bit more about sort of some moral philosophy side of things.
Sure.
So I'm particularly curious about how your views maybe have changed over time. I think there may be a bunch of people who have potentially even read some of your PhD thesis. And I'm curious if anything has changed since then.
Yeah, so one thing I'll say is, it's my dissertation is titled "On the Overwhelming Importance of Shaping the Far Future," and so it's easy to look at that and be like, this dissertation argued that like definitely, long-termism is the only thing that matters or something. But actually, if you look at it, it's kind of like, this is a really important hypothesis, and like here's a way of looking at it, and I'm focusing on questions about how to do the most good, and not necessarily questions about all the other aspects of moral philosophy, such as like rights and responsibilities and everything. So, so in some sense, there's a kind of a modest version of a claim and a strong version of a claim, and in some ways, I was defending a more modest version with a lot of caveats and everything. To answer your question directly, though, I do think there is a way in which I've kind of gotten a little bit less doctrinaire or something over time, which is like a common pattern for people as they just like get older. So I don't know. You could. I'm not sure which way you want to take that in terms of the evidential value of that update. But even as I was writing it, I think I think when I started writing, I was very sort of, well, like, this is the way, like utilitarianism all the way for the win. And I think part of that was, and while I think utilitarianism is an incredibly useful framework that often gets answers that are like importantly approximately right, especially for a philanthropist, I also think that, it is, it's kind of incomplete and known to not totally work for everything, including some of the like infinite cases and stuff. And that was part of what I talked about in my dissertation and part of like grappling with that. So, I think over time I've gone more in a direction of like treating some of these things as like very useful frameworks that generate conclusions that are kind of often right, but need to be like received and kind of tempered with a bit of like common sense in order to like make sure they don't go off the rails, either in terms of the details of whether it's like truly a calculation of like what the framework implies, or whether the framework is just kind of incomplete and like or off and doing something screwy in a particular case. So I don't know. That's a bit of a shift, but I think it's kind of an important one.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of kinds of areas where you think that utilitarianism doesn't quite get things right, and like a bit of more of the common sense morality is sort of a good sense check? Tough question.
Let's see what to say about that. So I mean, I mentioned the thing that's more theory-driven, like, it's just, I think utilitarianism just isn't built to handle infinities. And so if you have any credence in having, having eventually an infinite effect on the future in some way, everything kind of breaks and it just like isn't giving answers that make sense. So that's one kind of answer. There's also, I think I don't really want to take a stand on like kind of deep questions of like, is consequentialism more right or is deontology more right in these cases? I will say that, if somebody comes to me and says, I have a plan to do something that most people would think is ethically sketchy, but in the long run, it's going to help a lot with, humanity's long-term prospects. Like, I think most of the time I'm going to be like, please don't do that. And now you could debate, there's kind of an interesting debate whether that is like a kind of, practical guide. Is that people applying consequentialism badly, or is that consequentialism being wrong? But I do think that, I think like...
Maybe the conclusion is still clear either way.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you feel like, I'm wondering whether this feels like some of these cases are only the most extreme, like taken to the very limits, the sort of infinite ethics kind of cases, or whether you think, and so this is like, maybe it's just not practically that useful or like that relevant for what we do, or maybe it does just feel much more actually action guiding.
Well, it's an interesting question, to some degree, there's kind of, when you're thinking about like very long-term consequences and how everything plays out, there are a bunch of things that kind of get wacky and esoteric, and like, I'm not sure where you draw the line between, thinking about like a tail case of what might be possible eventually with technology and like actually involving infinities. And if somebody says like, oh, there's like a real difference between those, and like, I'm go for this one, but not that one. I think that's like a little bit tenuous. So that's like, I don't know, that's like a little bit of an answer. A way I agree more is that, I don't feel like I feel like, I think kind of consequentialism and like, common sense morality / deontological ethics, I think they often line up in kind of ordinary life, and the questions, the dilemmas that I'm dealing with at work like do not feel like trolley problems or something. They like feel a lot more like like being on a hiring committee and like arguing about which of these visions makes the most sense, and arguing about
to the tracks
AI timelines or something. And so I think some of those things feel kind of not that relevant to our work and sort of like overrated as things to kind of like debate about, at least for practical purposes. Yeah.
And so then I'm wondering, how useful have you felt your philosophy training has been in your practical grant-making work day to day?
Yeah, good question. It's a little hard to know, but I guess I do feel like it's been pretty useful. How has it been useful? I think it's been useful just for like meeting people. So like I don't know that I would have like met all the same people that I ended up working closely with at different stages in my life if I hadn't like studied in the particular courses that I did. And so there's a bit of that. I also think it was good to just have some time to really think about moral foundations of kind of like how to do the most good. And I think that, I don't know, it feels like that's made my thinking clearer and made it more possible to productively weigh in on various debates. And then I think it's been pretty useful just something about writing and a particular style for like considering and handling objections. So I don't know, people could vary in terms of how useful they find those things, but I have found that fairly useful. I I don't want to oversell it, like I think maybe, I think there might be, better ways to get equivalent types of benefits, but I think it's been pretty good for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you have kind of jumped a bit between the worlds of academic philosophy and sort of practical philanthropy and grant making.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of like how, have you found do you feel like you found your niche, and sort of how do you feel like is the best way of like working out what's going to be the best fit for someone, whether they should go hard down the route of like, I'm going to become a philosophy professor versus, actually I'm a much better fit for sort of doing this like hands-on philanthropy stuff?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can say, in my own case, something that appealed to me a lot about leaving FHI to work at Open Phil was a feeling of like, well, before I'd like write these papers, and you don't want to write like an overly specific paper about what should be done because it's like not very timeless or something, or it's like not as broad or big picture, and then you hope that like good things come of that, and in many ways good things really did come of that with other people at FHI and like Nick Bostrom's work. I was leaving to join in like 2013, and then sort of superintelligence is coming out and having a big splash, and so I don't want to underrate that work, but I found something very appealing about the idea of, I think something should happen. I'm going to write an email to a person saying that we should provide the funds to enable it. Mm-hmm. Then it's going to move forward. And there's something that I find very appealing about like being action-oriented in that way. And like we're kind of like, all right, this is an idea that's important. We're going to act on it. We're going to take the next steps. So there's something that just like matches my temperament for that. And there's something that I like about these types of roles. So that I guess that's a piece of it. I don't know how people would decide between those things. I think if you like being a little bit more action-oriented in that way, then maybe that would be an argument for the grant-making type stuff. And if you like kind of debating like sort of timeless questions and like being able to like really dig to the bottom of it, and because we're making decisions with like kind of absurdly little time and kind of have to just make them and move on. If that appeals to you, then maybe like that kind of personality might be a better fit for an academic setting. There's also just like, maybe depends on like how many balls you like keeping in the air. If you like keeping a lot of balls in the air, that would be like more of an argument for like grant maker life between those two. If you're kind of more like, I want to be writing like one paper at any given time, or maybe at most 3, and like there's like 1 to 3 things I'm responsible for. That would be a kind of another filter.
They do feel quite different, and in part it just feels like quite interesting that you've been really good at both. Because they are like opposite ends of the spectrum, having to make decisions on grants in like less minutes versus like working on a paper for months.
They are different, yeah.
Okay, so just as a last kind of question to wrap things up, you've been involved in the effective altruism community for a really long time now, and have seen like how things have like grown and changed. I'm just curious about what you feel like is something that we've got right, or that you're really proud of the community having achieved in that time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that I'm proud of in terms of the community's accomplishments and also its culture. So I don't know, in terms of accomplishments, I think there's been hundreds of millions of dollars moved to GiveWell's top charities that has probably, I believe, saved or will save over 100,000 lives, and has done a lot of good independently of that. Very proud of like the things that people have done in animal welfare. The cage-free egg campaigns, I think, are totally changing the way eggs are produced in the United States and in Europe. And I think people in the effective altruism community made big contributions to that. I think like artificial intelligence as like an existential risk has been, the EA community has played a big role in like putting that on the map. And although we're not that close to solving it as a problem, I am excited about some of the people that have been recruited to work on that and take it seriously. I'm excited about kind of the burgeoning efforts in biosecurity that are getting clearer and crisper over time. And so excited about all of that. And in terms of the community's culture, I really value the open-mindedness, and I really value that people are putting the beings that they're trying to help first over, kind of, I don't know, personal interests or like what sounds good. I like that people are kind of rigorous about the truth and kind of don't like it when people are kind of selling their work too much. I think that that's really good, really important. I like that there's a lot of sincerity where people, they think through arguments, and they're like, this implies that I should do something radically different with my life, but I've thought about it, and it's weird, and I'm going to do it. And I have a lot of respect for that, so very happy to be part of this community.
Mm-hmm. It is a very unusual and very, I think, virtuous trait to have. Thank you very much, Nick Beckstead. That's all we have time for, so round of applause, please, for Nick.
Thank you very much.